I was splitting firewood behind my old farmhouse at the edge of the Montana foothills, doing what I always did on cold mornings to keep the furnace from completely giving up on me when I heard the low rumble of engines rolling across the gravel road that led to my property. Out here, where the wind carried sound for miles and any visitor was usually a neighbor checking on livestock or a delivery truck that took a wrong turn, the sound of multiple engines traveling together was enough to make me pause mid-swing. At first, I thought it might be hunters or some kind of search party, but the rumble grew louder and heavier until I finally set the axe aside and wiped my brow with the back of my glove. When I stepped out from behind the shed, I saw 3 black SUVs followed by a long Lincoln turning down my narrow dirt path like a convoy meant for someone with money influence or a reason to hide behind tinted windows. None of those descriptions fit a 64-year-old widower who could barely pay his property taxes. My stomach tightened as the vehicles came to a full stop in a straight line across my yard. I noticed Mrs. Blakely, my nearest neighbor, peeking through her curtains the moment those cars arrived, probably convinced I had gotten myself into legal trouble or financial disaster. Small towns know everything, or assume everything, and both can be dangerous. The Lincoln's door opened first, and a tall man in a dark overcoat stepped out, followed by 2 assistants who moved with the stiff precision of people accustomed to corporate hallways and high-stakes negotiations. The tall man scanned the property before his eyes landed on me. He approached with deliberate, calm hands, gloved posture straight as if he were walking into a boardroom rather than onto the patched dirt of an aging man's land. When he reached speaking distance, he said, "Mr. Hale. Are you Thomas Matthew Hale?" His tone was professional, almost rehearsed, and the way he said my full name made my breath hitch. No one used my middle name unless something serious was involved. I felt heat gather at the back of my neck and managed to say yes. "Why? What's going on?" instead of explaining. He reached inside his overcoat and pulled out an envelope. Not a clean new envelope. This one looked as if it had been carried through years, worn soft at the edges, the color faded slightly with time. The seal was intact, pressed down firmly like it had never been opened. Written across the front in handwriting I knew better than I wanted to admit were the words, "For Thomas Hale to be delivered when we find him." My heart lurched. The handwriting slammed into my memory with brutal force, pulling up a chapter of my life I never thought I would see again. For a moment I forgot the cold, forgot my breath, forgot the yard and the trees and the winter morning around me. Before I could gather myself enough to speak, 3 more men stepped out of the SUVs. All wore matching dark suits and carried leather files like high-ranking representatives bringing a message across state lines. The man in the overcoat nodded toward them and said, "Sir, we're here on behalf of Evan Brooks." The name hit me so hard I swayed on my feet. Evan Brooks. 32 years since I last saw him yet. The sound of his name was like a ghost suddenly breathing at my shoulder. Evan Brooks was the shivering 12-year-old boy I had pulled from a snowstorm and fed the one warm meal that changed the direction of both our lives. My throat tightened until I could barely swallow. The man continued, his voice gentler now, as if he understood the earthquake he had just triggered inside me. "Mr. Hale, Evan wanted you to have what he always said was yours." I stared at the envelope, my pulse thudding in my ears, unable to make sense of any of this. Why would a boy I fed, once a boy who vanished into the world without a trace, send attorneys to find me decades later? And what in God's name could he have left for me after all this time? As I looked at the convoy, at the suits, at the envelope sealed with a name from my past, one question rose louder than everything else in my head. What did that boy become? Life in the present had a way of feeling smaller than it used to, like the world had quietly stepped back and left me standing in an echo of everything I once had. After my wife Margaret passed 8 years ago, the house that had always felt too small suddenly became too large, with empty corners and hollow rooms that held her voice more clearly than they held mine. I retired early from the lumber mill when my back gave out, and the pension was barely enough to keep the lights on, let alone fix the roof that had been leaking every spring since 2019. Some days when the wind pushed snow against the window frames, I could swear the house groaned like an old man taking one more blow. He was never built to survive. Money was tight in a way that forced me to count every gallon of fuel, every grocery receipt, every medication refill. The furnace had been coughing for 3 winters straight, and I kept telling myself I'd call someone to fix it, but the truth was I couldn't afford the repair. Instead, I relied on chopped wood blankets and stubbornness. My son Daniel lived down in Texas with his wife and 2 kids. We spoke on holidays, sometimes on birthdays, but the distance between states felt smaller than the distance between our lives. He used to call every week after his mother died, but time has a way of smoothing urgency into routine and eventually routine into silence. I never blamed him for it. People move on. The world moves on. I guess I just stayed where I was. Most days I kept myself busy with chores, repairing fence posts, tending the small patch of potatoes in the summer, trying to keep the farm from collapsing into the dirt. But lately, with winter settling in again, I felt the weight of the years more heavily than usual. My hands ached from the cold, my knees protested every time I knelt, and sometimes I'd catch myself staring into the distance without knowing how long I'd been standing there. In the kitchen on the top shelf sat the old cast-iron pot my mother had given me when I left home at 19. It was scratched and blackened, the handle worn smooth by decades of stirring her stew recipe. Hale family stew, she used to call it, though the name sounded too grand for such a simple meal. It was the one thing that still connected me to her, to childhood, to warmth. I cooked it less often these days, mostly because sharing it with someone always made it taste better, and I hadn't had company at my table in years. I lived quietly, almost invisibly. No one asked about me. No one dropped by unless they were lost. And somewhere along the way, I started asking myself the kind of questions a man only asks when he has too much time and too little distraction. Had I done anything meaningful? Had my life changed anything? Would anyone remember me when I was gone? I thought about Evan more times than I ever admitted, wondering if he survived, if he found somewhere safe, if the world offered him even an ounce of mercy. But I always stopped myself from hoping too much. People like him disappeared. People like me grew old, wondering if they ever mattered. And until those black cars arrived, I would have sworn the answer was no. The man in the overcoat didn't step inside right away. Instead, he glanced toward the SUVs, gave a small nod, and 2 of the suited men carried a leather-bound case toward my porch as if they were handling something fragile or sacred. My pulse quickened partly from confusion and partly from the eerie sense that my quiet, predictable life had just collided with something far larger than I could comprehend. The lead attorney, as he introduced himself, said his name was Richard Calloway, and he spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had delivered impossible news before. "Mr. Hale," he said, opening the case with deliberate care, "we represent Brooks Hearth Company." The name hit me with the force of a falling tree. Brooks Hearth was everywhere. Television ads, billboards on highways, frozen stews and soups in every grocery store from Maine to California, and most of all their signature dish, the Hearth Bowl, a comfort meal so popular it practically became a national staple. I had eaten it once years ago, and something about it had felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Seeing my reaction, Richard continued, "I imagine you've heard of it." I nodded slowly, unsure what else to say. "Mr. Haley," he said, "the Hearth Bowl. The recipe that built the foundation of our company did not originate in any corporate kitchen." He reached into the case and pulled out a photograph. At first, I thought I was looking at a stranger, but then recognition dawned with a painful, warming shock. It was Evan, maybe in his late 20s, smiling beneath a restaurant sign, sleeves rolled up, eyes bright alive in a way I prayed he had someday been. My breath caught in my throat. Richard laid the photograph gently on my table, then revealed another document beneath it, an early branding draft listing recipe origins. And there, in small handwritten letters, were the words, "Recipe Origin. Thomas Hale, Hale, Family Stew." My vision blurred. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. "No," I whispered. "That can't be." But Richard shook his head. "It is. Evan credited you from the beginning. Every early investor knew your name. The challenge was finding you. Records showed you left Wyoming, changed jobs, changed addresses. The company has spent years repeating the search. My throat tightened as I forced out the question I was almost afraid to hear the answer to. Why now? Why today? Richard exchanged a glance with the assistants before answering softer this time. Because Evan left instructions. Because he wanted you found. The winter wind rattled the windows behind us as he delivered the final blow. And because Mr. Hale. Evan Brooks passed away 14 months ago. A sharp ache tore through my chest as if the cold outside had suddenly reached inside me. Before he died, Richard continued, he made certain you would receive what he believed was always yours. Winter of 1991 is a memory that never left me, not even in the years when I tried to bury it under responsibility and routine. I was 32 then, working as a cook at Riverside Diner in a small Wyoming town where the wind cut sharper than judgment, and the winters seemed designed to test a man's will. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's secrets but pretended they didn't, and where a good meal was sometimes the only comfort people could count on. I had taken the job after my father died, carrying with me the only inheritance he had left behind, my mother's cast-iron pot and the handwritten recipe for Hale family stew. She used to say it was a poor man's feast, simple ingredients, but made with patience and heart. I didn't know then how far that recipe would travel, or how deeply it would mark someone else's life. On the night everything changed, the snow was coming down so thick it blurred the neon diner sign and muffled the sound of passing cars. It was close to closing time, and I was sweeping the back hallway, half wishing the storm would knock out the power so I could go home early. When I pushed open the back door to toss out the trash, the icy wind hit me hard enough to steal my breath. And then I heard a faint rustling behind the dumpster, like something small trying to make itself smaller. At first I thought it was a stray dog, but when I stepped closer, shining my flashlight, I saw a boy. A thin, pale, shaking boy curled up against the metal like he was trying to disappear into it. His jacket was ripped, his jeans soaked, and his fingers were stiff with cold. He looked up at me with the kind of eyes you don't forget, eyes that had seen too much and received too little. He couldn't have been older than 12, maybe younger. I remember asking, "Hey, kid, what are you doing out here?" His voice was barely a whisper. Just trying to stay warm. There was something in his tone that hit me straight in the chest, a mixture of fear and exhaustion that I recognized from my own childhood after losing my mother. Without thinking, I held out my hand. "Come inside." "You'll freeze out here." He hesitated, like he was deciding whether trusting me was worth the risk, but the cold made the decision for him. He followed me into the kitchen, trailing water onto the floor. Once inside, he kept his arms wrapped tight around himself, watching everything with the hyper-awareness of someone who had learned life the hard way. I handed him a towel and asked his name. He hesitated before saying, "Evan." I didn't push for more. Instead, I reached for the cast-iron pot and set it on the stove. I didn't have much left in the pantry, but I had enough. A few potatoes, some vegetables, a chunk of meat, and the worn card with my mother's handwriting that I never cooked without reading first. As the stew simmered, filling the kitchen with warmth and the smell of garlic and thyme, Evan's shoulders began to loosen. He watched the steam rise like he hadn't seen a warm meal in months. When I placed the bowl in front of him, he stared at it for several seconds before picking up the spoon. Then he ate. Slowly at first, like he wasn't sure it was real, then faster and faster until he paused only to breathe. "When was the last time you ate?" I asked, quietly. He shook his head. "I don't remember. I didn't ask anything else. Some stories hurt more when spoken aloud." When he finished, he looked different, not healed, but less hollow. I told him he could sleep in the storage room for the night. He nodded, clutching the towel like a lifeline. I remember checking on him later, finding him curled on a pile of old blankets, breathing softly, finally warm. Something inside me softened in a way I didn't expect. I had been carrying so much grief for so long, losing my mother young, growing distant from my father, feeling the world shrink after every loss. But seeing that boy fragile yet fighting reminded me of something I had forgotten. I still had something to give. Evan stayed the next night and the night after that. Each evening, when I made the stew, he watched closely, asking small questions, memorizing every step as if the recipe itself was a secret to survival. He had a sharp mind, noticing proportions and timing like he was born to taste and create. I didn't know then that those quiet nights in the kitchen, those bowls of stew, and those moments of fragile hope would become the foundation of an empire and the beginning of a decades-long bond that would outlast both distance and time. The weeks that followed were some of the strangest and most unexpectedly meaningful days of my life, the kind of days that sneak up on you quietly and then sit in your memory forever, like warm embers refusing to burn out. Evan stayed longer than either of us planned. At first, I told myself it was because of the weather, because no decent human being could send a 12-year-old back into a Wyoming winter storm. But even after the skies cleared and the snow settled into calm sheets across the rooftops, I kept finding reasons to tell him, just one more night, and he kept silently accepting. Every morning he emerged from the storage room rubbing sleep from his eyes, hair, messy clothes, still the same worn layers, but his face a little less haunted each day. He would stand awkwardly at the edge of the kitchen until I handed him a task, and he always tackled it with the kind of focus that made grown men look careless. He scrubbed dishes until they shined, wiped tables with precision-swept floors, as if each stroke mattered. The other diner employees whispered among themselves, not sure if they should worry or admire the boy who appeared from nowhere and worked harder than most adults. I heard comments like "Tom's taken in a stray" or "that kid's trouble waiting to happen," but I ignored them. There was something in Evan that felt familiar, like a bruise you forget about until something touches it just right. He reminded me of the version of myself who had lost his mother, who had tried to survive by learning how to be invisible. Over time, Evan loosened up. He started humming while he worked, sometimes tapping the counter with his fingers in a rhythm that seemed to come from nowhere. One evening after closing, he found an old radio behind the freezer. It barely worked, but when he adjusted the antenna, a faint country station came through. He listened with a tilted head as if the music was a language he understood better than English. That same night, while I cooked a fresh pot of stew, he watched every move I made. "How do you know when it's ready?" he asked. His voice was still soft, but not as fragile as before. I held up the wooden spoon and let him taste the broth. "You learn to listen to the food," I said. "Your tongue remembers things your mind forgets." He repeated the phrase under his breath like it meant more to him than it should. Before long, he began helping with the cooking. He chopped vegetables, carefully added salt, one pinch at a time, and always paused before tasting, like each spoonful might reveal something he had been searching for his whole life. There was a night one I will never forget when we both stayed late. The diner had closed hours earlier. The chairs flipped upside down on the tables, the lights dimmed except for the warm glow in the kitchen. I was cleaning the stove when I heard Evan muttering to himself. He was standing at the prep station, stirring a small pot with his skinny arm shaking slightly from the effort. I watched from a distance as he tasted with the spoon, frowned, added a tiny bit of pepper, tasted again, then broke into the smallest, proudest smile. "Tom," he said, eyes shining. "Taste this." I did, and I nearly dropped the spoon. It wasn't my mother's stew, not exactly. It was something different, lighter, brighter. A version shaped by instinct rather than tradition. "You did this?" I asked. He nodded, suddenly nervous. "Is it bad?" "No," I said, feeling emotion tighten in my chest. "It's good, really good." That moment unlocked something in him. The next few nights he stayed awake with me, experimenting with spices, testing little variations, scribbling notes in a torn notebook he found near the register. He wrote slowly, carefully, like writing itself was a skill he hadn't fully mastered yet. "Where did you learn to do this?" I asked him once. He shrugged. "I just taste things. It's like I can see the flavors in my head." I stared at him, wondering how many gifts go unnoticed simply because no one ever gives the child who holds them a safe place to grow. As the days passed, he started talking more. Hesitant, fragmented sentences at first, then fuller thoughts. One night after dinner, he sat with me at the counter and said, "You don't have to keep me. You know, I'm not keeping you," I replied. "You're choosing to stay." He looked down at his hands. No one ever chose me before." The words hit me harder than he knew. Later that same night, while washing dishes, he asked, "Why did you help me?" It wasn't the question itself, but the tremor in his voice that made me stop scrubbing the pan and look him straight in the eye. I took a deep breath and said the truth, because no one should face the cold alone. He blinked slowly, absorbing every syllable. Then he quietly reached for his notebook and wrote the sentence down as if it were too important to trust to memory. Over the next 2 weeks, he continued evolving just as the recipe in his hands evolved. He made tiny changes, recorded results, asked thoughtful questions. The boy had a palate like I had never seen in a child or adult. He could identify ingredients, blindfolded measure spices by instinct, and create harmony in flavors the way others created harmony in music. But life, as always, had a way of interrupting the good. One night, the owner of the diner, Frank Porter, came in unexpectedly. He spotted Evan drying dishes and pulled me aside with a scowl. "You can't keep some street kid in here," Frank growled. "He's not on payroll, it's liability. If something happens, it's on us," I argued. Hard. I told Frank I'd take responsibility, that Evan was helping voluntarily, that he never caused trouble. But Frank only grew harsher. "Get rid of him, or I will." Evan overheard. I could tell by the way his shoulders hunched and his eyes dimmed. He didn't say anything, but I could feel the fear radiating off him. That night, he went to bed quietly, and for the first time since he arrived, he closed the door of the storage room between us. The next morning, when the sun pushed a pale ribbon of light through the frosted windows of the diner, I walked into the kitchen expecting to see Evan perched on the stool by the prep table waiting for the day's first instructions like he always did. Instead, the kitchen felt colder than usual, as if something vital had been removed overnight. The storage room door was wide open. The blankets he slept on were neatly folded, and the small notebook he guarded like treasure was gone. At first, I stood there frozen, telling myself he had simply gone outside, maybe to fetch something or walk off the tension from the night before, but the longer I waited, the clearer it became that he wasn't coming back. I stepped outside, scanning the alley behind the diner, calling his name into the cold morning air that swallowed my voice. Snow had drifted lightly overnight, covering most tracks, but near the dumpster I spotted faint impressions, small footprints leading toward the road, already softening under fresh flakes. My chest tightened as I followed them until they disappeared entirely near the highway. For a long moment, all I could do was stand there, letting the wind whip against my jacket, while a familiar, unwelcome guilt pooled in my stomach. I had told Evan he didn't have to face the cold alone, but when he needed someone to defend him, I had failed. Maybe I should have fought harder with Frank. Maybe I should have taken Evan home with me instead of letting him sleep in a storage room. Maybe I should have known that a boy who had been abandoned so many times would run at the first sign of being unwanted again. Inside the kitchen on the counter where he liked to sit and watch me cook, I saw a small folded piece of paper. My heartbeat stuttered as I opened it, recognizing his careful, uneven handwriting. It said only one line. "Someday, I'll return what you gave me." No name, no goodbye. Just a promise I never expected him to make and never believed he would keep. I slipped the note into my wallet, pressing it flat with trembling fingers, already fearing it would be the last trace I'd ever have of him. After that day, I searched the town, walking every street, asking at gas stations, grocery stores, even the local shelter, though he'd told me he feared them. No one had seen a boy matching his description. Some people shrugged. Others offered pitying looks that made the ache worse, and one officer reminded me that runaway kids often kept moving from town to town like ghosts no one could hold on to. As days turned into weeks, the hole Evan left behind grew sharper, not softer. His absence settled into the diner like a chill the furnace couldn't touch. The silence after closing time felt heavier without his footsteps in the kitchen, without his humming or the soft scrape of his pencil across that notebook. The pot on the stove no longer smelled the same. I tried to remake the stew the way he had changed it, but it tasted hollow, like something essential was missing. I told myself he was strong, resourceful, smart. I told myself he would survive. But, late at night, lying awake in my small apartment, I worried that the world might eat him alive, that he might freeze somewhere on a night like the one I found him, that the next time someone opened a back door to throw away trash, they wouldn't be in time. Over the years, life moved me forward because it had to, but the guilt stayed lodged inside me like a splinter I could never reach. I kept the note in my wallet, carried it through every job, every move, every season. Wherever I went, I checked for him at bus stops, street corners, diners, and towns I passed through. And though I never saw him again, a part of me never stopped waiting for that promise to come true. Years passed, not quickly, but with the slow, grinding pace of someone trying to keep his life from slipping further into quiet obscurity. I changed towns twice, worked jobs that didn't require more than strong hands and a willingness to show up on time, and did my best to keep my head above the financial currents that pulled so many men my age under. Through all of it, Evan remained a ghost in my memory, a name I never spoke aloud, but carried like a bruise that never fully healed. Then, one evening, maybe 6 or 7 years after he disappeared, I was driving home from a late shift at the lumber yard when the radio crackled to life with a segment about the young culinary sensation taking America by storm. Normally, I would have switched stations, but something in the broadcaster's tone made me pause. At only 20 years old, the host said he's built a small empire around one signature dish, a stew called the Hearth Bowl. The name alone made my foot ease off the gas. Hearth Bowl. A chill ran up my spine, even though the heater was blowing full blast. I turned the volume up as the broadcaster continued. Evan Brooks, founder of Brooks Hearth, says the recipe came from a man who once showed him kindness when he had nothing. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. Evan Brooks. The voice on the radio shifted into an interview clip, and though it was deeper, stronger, undeniably older, I recognized the cadence instantly. It was the first real meal I ever had, Evan said. Someone took care of me when he didn't have to. That recipe saved my life before it saved my career. My heart hammered at my ribs. I pulled the truck to the side of the road and sat there in disbelief as the host described the rapid rise of Brooks Hearth pop-up stands in Colorado and Utah. Word-of-mouth lines stretching down sidewalks, investors swarming to him, and eventually the opening of his first brick-and-mortar restaurant in Denver. Pictures flashed through my mind. Evan standing beside me chopping vegetables. Evan tasting broth with focused eyes. Evan writing in that torn notebook. He had remembered. He had taken the recipe with him, and he had built something from it. Pride hit me first. Raw, overwhelming pride that the boy I'd tried to protect had become a man capable of changing his own fate. But right behind it came the ache, sharp and familiar. He hadn't reached out, not once. Over the next decade, Brooks Hearth exploded across the country. TV features, cooking competitions. Magazine covers, a best-selling memoir that I always meant to read but never bought because seeing his face on a book felt strange, like opening a wound I wasn't sure had healed. I'd catch glimpses of him on morning shows while buying groceries. Always poised, always grateful, always crediting an unnamed man who fed him during the darkest winter of his life. He'd say things like, "Kindness was my turning point," and "Someone showed me I mattered," and each time he spoke I felt both lifted and crushed. If he remembered me so vividly, why had he never tried to find me? That question lingered for years until a local paper ran a feature on his philanthropic work. Near the bottom of the article, one line changed everything. Brooks spent over a decade searching for the man who inspired the Hearth Bowl, but was unable to locate him. Records from that time showed conflicting names and several moved addresses. For the first time, I realized the truth. Evan had looked. He just never found me. The ache inside me softened into something gentler, something almost like forgiveness. A boy running for survival wouldn't have known my last name. A man building an empire wouldn't know where life had pushed me after I left Wyoming. His success grew, and so did his influence. Brooks Hearth became a household name, earning praise for feeding millions with comfort food that felt like home. And every time I saw the Hearth Bowl at the grocery store or heard someone rave about its flavor, I felt a tug deep inside me, pride intertwined with sorrow, because I knew exactly where that flavor came from. It came from a winter night in a tiny diner kitchen when a cold, hungry boy tasted hope for the first time. The room felt smaller the moment Richard spoke Evan's name, as if the walls themselves recognized it and leaned in to listen. I stood there, gripping the back of a chair for balance, while the winter light filtered through the grimy window panes, catching dust in the air like suspended memories. Richard let the silence settle before he continued, as if giving me time to process what my heart already understood, but my mind refused to accept. "Mr. Hale," he said gently, "Evan passed away 14 months ago." The words dropped into the room like a stone thrown into deep water. There was no sound, just a spreading heaviness that reached every corner of me. I felt the floor tilt under my boots. Evan, the boy I had fed, sheltered, hoped for, had lived an entire life without me and then left it before I even knew he was gone. I sank into the nearest chair. My hands trembled against my knees. How I managed to ask. Richard placed a folder on the table, his expression respectful. A congenital heart condition. He had known about it for years. It progressed faster than expected. My throat tightened around a grief that felt disorientingly fresh. I had spent 3 decades wondering if he was alive, imagining him thriving somewhere, and now the finality hit like a blow. Richard opened the folder and slid a small tablet toward me. "Mr. Hale, before Evan passed, he recorded something. He left instructions that this video be played for you only when we found you." Every part of me wanted to refuse to hold on to the image of him alive, smiling on those magazine covers, but my fingers moved anyway, tapping the screen. The tablet lit up, and there he was, Evan. Older, thinner, but unmistakably himself. His eyes still carried that mix of sharpness and vulnerability I remembered from the boy in my kitchen. He gave a small smile. "Hey, Tom." My breath hitched. It had been decades since anyone called me that. "If you're watching this, then they found you. I'm glad. I've been trying to find you for years." He paused, exhaling shakily. "I owe you more than you ever knew. That night you took me in, that stew, it was the first time I felt safe. The first time I felt like someone saw me. I leaned forward, unable to look away. Everything I built," Evan continued, "came from that meal, from your recipe, from the way you treated me like I mattered. I've spent my whole life carrying that night with me." He swallowed hard, fighting emotion. "I always meant to come back, but life got big and complicated and I kept trying to find the right moment. I guess I ran out of them." He gave a sad laugh. "But I didn't forget. Not one day." The screen faded to black. I sat unmoving, heart-pounding, tears gathering at the corners of my eyes. Richard cleared his throat softly. "Mr. Hale, Evan didn't just credit you in spirit. He credited you legally." He reached into the leather case and withdrew a document sealed in protective plastic. He placed it in front of me. My name, Thomas Hale, was typed beneath the line marked Recipe Origin Contributor. From the very beginning, Richard said Evan listed you as co-creator of the original Hearth Bowl. Over the years, that attribution remained in every update, every contract, every licensing agreement. I stared at my name, unable to believe it. But I didn't do anything I whispered. It was his work, his idea, his success. Richard shook his head. Evan disagreed. He often said, "Without Tom, there is no recipe. Without that night, there is no Brooks Hearth." He made sure your share was preserved. He made sure it grew. I rubbed my forehead, overwhelmed, trying to absorb a truth that bent everything I understood about my past. He wanted you found. Richard added softly, because he wanted you to have what he believed always belonged to you. I closed my eyes, breathing shakily as the full weight of his words settled onto me. Evan had remembered. Evan had been searching. Evan had built a life with a piece of mine woven into it. And now, even in death, he had reached back with a final act of gratitude that felt bigger than anything I knew how to hold. Richard waited until I had steadied my breathing before he reached again into the leather case and pulled out another folder. This one thicker bound with a band that looked far too official for the life I'd been living. He placed it gently on the table, almost reverently, as though it contained something sacred rather than pages of legal text. Mr. Hale, he said, his tone shifting into something deliberate and measured. Evan arranged for your portion of the Brooks Hearth equity to be held in a protected fund until the day you were located. No one, not investors, not executives, not even the board, could access it or redirect it. It was legally untouchable. My pulse quickened, thudding in my ears. I swallowed hard. My portion, Richard opened the folder and turned it around so it faced me. 20%, he said, simply as though he were informing me the weather would be cold tonight. I blinked at him, certain I had misheard. 20%? Of what? Of all revenue, derived from the original Hearth Bowl recipe and its subsequent expansions. In Evan's words, give Tom what is his. The room swayed slightly. I gripped the edge of the table to keep myself anchored in place. Richard slid a single document forward. Bold numbers stretched across the page, more zeros than my mind could organize into meaning. Current valuation of Mr. Evan Brooks's designated share for you is $41,882,900. The world went silent. No sound, no breath, no sense of time. Just the impossible weight of a number that did not belong anywhere near the life I had lived. I heard myself whisper, "Oh, no, that can't be right." Richard did not flinch. It is accurate. The Hearth Bowl became one of the highest-selling comfort dishes in the nation, licensed across retail restaurants and international markets. And every year your portion continued to grow. Evan refused to alter your percentage despite multiple attempts by advisors to consolidate ownership. My chest tightened with confusion. Disbelief, guilt, an emotional storm I could not untangle. I didn't earn this, I said, my voice cracking under the strain. It was his empire, his work, his vision. Richard's expression softened in a way I hadn't seen from him before. Sir, Evan believed differently. He once told us, Tom gave me the only thing that ever saved me, a recipe, a night of safety, a belief that I mattered. He insisted your influence was foundational. I shook my head slowly, fighting back tears that blurred the ink on the page. All I did was feed him, I murmured. All I did was make him stew for one night. Richard leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes one night is enough to rewrite the entire course of a life. Evan built a company, yes. But the spark, the moment that awakened his purpose, began with you. My throat tightened around a surge of grief so sharp it almost felt like pain. The thought of Evan pouring years of effort into finding me, protecting my share, honoring a promise he'd left on a scrap of paper. It overwhelmed me in a way I wasn't prepared for. I covered my face with my hands, my shoulders shaking as the weight of 30 years collapsed into a single moment. I wasn't crying for the money. I was crying for the boy who had returned in the only way he could. Richard waited in respectful silence until I lowered my hands. There is more, he said softly. Evan requested that the funds be transferred to your name immediately, and he expressed one final wish in his directives that you decide what to do with this legacy. My eyes drifted back to the number on the page, an impossible fortune born from a simple act of kindness I never thought twice about at the time. And, as I stared at it, feeling the echo of Evan's voice in every corner of the room, one truth settled into my bones with quiet certainty. This wasn't money. It was a promise finally kept. Richard reached once more into the leather case, this time with a care so deliberate it made the room fall into a hush. He retrieved a single envelope, aged at the edges, sealed with wax marked in handwriting. I recognized instantly, painfully, like a memory touching a bruise that never healed. My name, written in that same uneven slant Evan had as a boy, stretched across the front to Tom. My breath stalled. My hands hesitated. For 30 years I had imagined hearing from him again, seeing him again, even just knowing whether he had survived. Never, not once, did I imagine holding a final letter from him, written with the knowledge he wouldn't live long enough to deliver it himself. Richard placed it in my palm and stepped back, giving me space, and for a moment all I could do was stare at the envelope, feeling the weight of decades pressing against my chest. Finally, with a shaky breath, I broke the seal. Inside was a folded sheet of thick paper worn from being handled many times, maybe by Evan himself, as he rewrote and reconsidered what to say. I unfolded it carefully. The first line hit me harder than anything so far. Tom, I've wanted to write this letter for most of my life. My throat tightened. The words blurred and I blinked hard before forcing myself to continue reading. I don't know where you are right now or what your life looks like, but I hope you're sitting down. I imagine you're older, probably still stubborn, probably still working harder than you should. I can hear your voice in my head telling me I overthink things. So let me say this the only way I know how. Thank you. That night you found me behind the diner changed the direction of my entire life. I remember everything. I remember how cold I was, how hungry I was, and how I didn't trust a single person on this earth. And then you opened the back door and changed the rules. You handed me a towel. You made me stew. You never asked for anything in return. For the first time I can remember I didn't feel like trash or a problem or a burden. I felt like a kid. Just a kid. I stopped reading for a moment, gripping the paper as emotion surged through me. I could see him as he was that night, small, shaking, silent. Something inside me cracked open all over again. I forced myself onward. You should know something, even if it's hard to hear. I left because I heard the owner say you had to get rid of me. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I stayed, you'd get in trouble or lose your job, and I couldn't bear the idea of hurting the one person who ever helped me. I walked away that morning, even though it felt like tearing off a piece of myself. I waited for anger, bitterness, something, but all I felt was a familiar ache. Evan continued. I took your recipe with me. Not to steal it, not to claim it. I carried it because it was the only thing in my life that felt like home. Every flavor reminded me of that night. Every batch reminded me of your voice. Every bowl reminded me that someone cared. When I was 16, I started cooking it for people at the shelters. When I was 18, I made a version of it for a church kitchen where I volunteered. People kept asking for it. They kept saying it tasted like love, like memory, like comfort, and all I could think was, this is Tom. At 20, I opened my first little stand. It wasn't meant to be a business. I just wanted people to feel what I felt that night in your kitchen. Safe, warm, seen. I felt my hands shaking as I held the letter. Evan's words poured through me like warm water on frozen ground. The next part made my breath hitch. When investors approached me, I told them the truth. I told them the original recipe belonged to someone else. They told me to claim it as my own. I refused. I told them your name. But I didn't know where you were. Records said you moved. When I searched for Thomas Hale, I found 3. None were you. I kept trying. For 12 years I tried. And as the company grew, the guilt grew with it, because every success brought me back to the truth that you deserved to share in it. You gave me more than a meal. You gave me the belief that I had worth, and worth is something no child should have to earn. I wanted to go to the police station that morning in 1991. I wanted to give your name for contact, but I didn't know your last name. I only knew you as Tom, and by the time I figured out your full name, you were gone again. The next lines were shakier, as if his hand trembled writing them. I don't know how much time I have left as I write this. Doctors gave me timelines, but I stopped listening. What I didn't stop doing was making sure the part of Brooke's hearth that belongs to you would stay yours. You may think you didn't earn it, but you did, more than anyone. You showed me what kindness looked like. You gave me safety without expecting anything back. You shared your mother's recipe with me when I had nothing of my own worth sharing. You saved a child who didn't think he deserved saving, and that one act brought 1,000,000 meals into the world. My vision blurred again. A tear hit the paper, dissolving a small corner of ink. Evan continued. Tom, I need one last thing from you, and I'm asking from the part of me that never stopped being that cold, scared kid in your kitchen. Please use what I left you to help someone else. Help the kids like me, the ones hiding behind dumpsters, the ones sleeping in alleys, the ones who just need one warm meal to believe life can be different. Feed them. Give them safety. Give them hope. pass it forward. When you do, it will feel like you and I are standing in that kitchen again. You cooking, me watching. Both of us learning what family really means." There was a small pause in the handwriting, then the final lines, "And Tom. I kept your note. Someday I'll return what you gave me. I kept it in my wallet all my life. This is me keeping my promise. Thank you for the stew. Thank you for the warmth. Thank you for saving me. I owe everything to you. With love, you may never fully understand, Evan." My chest caved in from the weight of those words. I held the letter against my heart, unable to breathe, unable to speak, letting decades of hope, regret, pride, and grief crash over me like a storm I'd been walking toward my entire life. Evan was gone, but in that moment he felt closer than ever, and the boy I thought I'd lost forever had finally come home in the only way he could. In the days that followed, the letter never left my side. I kept it folded carefully in the inner pocket of my flannel shirt, checking for it the way some men check for a wedding band or a prayer card. I read it every morning before the kettle finished heating, and every night before I turned off the lamp. And with each reading, something in my chest, something that had been locked tight for decades, began to thaw. Grief, yes. Regret, absolutely. But also a strange and unexpected sense of purpose, like the world had turned me back toward a road I was always meant to walk. One week after the attorneys first arrived, I called Richard and told him I wanted to meet with the Brooks Hearth Board. He sounded almost relieved, as if he had been waiting for me to make the choice on my own. They flew me to Denver, a city I hadn't visited since I was young, and escorted me through the glass doors of a building carrying Evan's name in bold silver letters. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of herbs and roasted vegetables, the same scent that used to fill the diner kitchen all those years ago. It hit me so hard I had to stop walking. The board members greeted me like I was someone important, someone they had talked about for years, someone whose story had turned into a legend behind closed doors. I wasn't used to that. I didn't know if I ever would be. But I shook their hands and sat down, clutching Evan's letter like a compass. Richard explained my intentions, but I spoke for myself when the room grew quiet. I told them I didn't want the money for a new house or vacations or indulgence. I wanted to build something that would outlive me, something that would honor the boy who changed my life as much as I changed his. And so, with their partnership, the Hale and Brooks Foundation was born, a place dedicated to feeding homeless youth, teaching them basic culinary skills and giving them shelter long enough to remember they deserve safety and warmth. We bought a building on the east side of town, renovated the kitchen to look like a modern version of the diner where everything began, and opened our doors within 8 months. On opening night, donors, chefs, journalists, and people who had loved the Hearth Bowl for decades gathered in the courtyard strung with soft lights. A small stage had been set up, and on it sat a framed photograph of Evan at 19, standing beside his first food stand, smiling the shy smile that had once belonged to a scared 12-year-old boy in my kitchen. When they asked me to speak, I felt my knees weaken, but I stepped forward anyway. I told them about the storm in 1991, about the boy behind the dumpster, about the stew, about the noise of the world falling away when he tasted something warm for the first time. And most of all about the single act of kindness that stitched our lives together across decades. There were tears in the crowd, mine theirs, people who had never met Evan but felt connected to him through the food he created. After the speeches, a group of young chefs from Brooks Hearth prepared the first official batch of Hale family stew to serve at the foundation. When I tasted it, I closed my eyes and felt the presence of two people who had shaped my life, my mother, whose recipe carried generations of love, and Evan, whose gratitude had come full circle. Back home in Montana, I hung 3 things on my living room wall. The folded note Evan left on the diner counter the morning he disappeared, the first page of his recipe notebook preserved behind glass, and a copy of the original Brooks Hearth logo. Every morning, I look at them and whisper the same words. We did it, kid. And I mean it, because kindness when given freely never disappears. It circles back, not always in the way you expect, not always in your lifetime, but always in time. If you stayed with me through this story, I want to tell you something from the bottom of my heart. What happened between me and Evan wasn't magic, and it wasn't luck. It was a single moment where one person chose kindness when the world expected nothing at all. That's the part I hope you carry with you when this video ends. One warm meal didn't change the world that night. It didn't erase every hardship or heal every wound. But it lit a spark in a boy who had spent his life in darkness, and that spark grew into something larger than either of us could have imagined. Maybe that's the lesson we forget too easily as we get older. We start believing we don't make a difference anymore, that the world moves too fast for one person's goodness to matter. But the truth is, the world has always changed one small act at a time. A door opened during a storm. A bowl of stew handed to a cold boy. A sentence spoken from the heart. These are the things that echo across years and come back when you least expect them. If this story touched you, let it remind you that every one of us has the power to leave a mark. You never know who is watching, who is hurting, or who is waiting for a sign that someone still cares. And if you believe in the power of stories like this, stories about kindness, redemption, second chances, then please like this video, share it. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps these messages reach more people who may need them today. 1. Kindness changed Evan's life. One click might help someone else hear the message they've been waiting for. Thank you for being here.